Hey friends, the Exiles and Babylon conference is just a few days away, folks. April 3rd to 5th, Minneapolis, Minnesota. All the info is at theologyintheraw.com. If you want to attend, still room to sign up. If you can't make it out to Minneapolis, then you can also watch live online. But if you do want to come, you got to register like yesterday. So theologyintheraw.com, all the information is there. Beth Allison Barr is my guest today. Beth is a James Vardaman professor of history at Baylor University in Waco, Texas, author of several books, including the recently released Becoming the Pastor's Wife. Here's the book right here if you're watching. How Marriage Replaced Ordination as a Woman's Path to Ministry. Really, really, really loved this conversation. Beth is always a delight to talk to. So please welcome back to the show, the one and only Dr. Beth Allison Barr. Beth Allison Barr, good to see you again. It's been a couple of years, I think.
Yeah,
How
good to see you.
Yeah.
I'm okay.
Well, okay. So I just got to, because I don't know. I got to jump into this. This is your new book, Becoming the Pastor's Wife. And I have to say, I got a bit of a funny story. So we get sent a lot of books from, authors and publicists and everything. So they're always like lying around the house. And sometimes, given my line of work, the books are, they're more adult content, not in the, non-Christian way,
Yes,
whatever. But,
I understand.
so sometimes my kids are older now, so it doesn't matter. But before I was like, oh, I got to take this one downstairs, But this book was sitting around, and people who are just listening can't see it. But it's got a picture of this like 1950s, like Leave It to Beaver wife. You have the background look like is it a Catholic saint?
Yes, it is.
Or
It's
not?
a medieval, yeah. It's Catherine of Alexandria.
I was going to assume that's probably a specific like medieval saint.
Yeah.
But the title, Becoming the Pastor's Wife. And I remember my wife saw this, and she's like, oh, no, this is not. She was like, I could feel the triggers going off because of the image, the title. And I had to reassure her. I'm like, no, this is Beth Allison Barr wrote this. I'm pretty sure she's not going to be advocating for what you think this book is advocating for. And she's like,
absolutely.
And she's like, I don't know. I'm like, can you get that book off my couch? I'm like, no, I'm serious. You would probably really like this book. Anyway, we had a fun time discussing that. And even now it's coming down. I'm like, hey, I'm gonna do a podcast about this book. She's like, are you serious? I'm like, no, I'm serious. It's not what you think.
Tell her,
anyway.
I'll send her a signed copy, and she can be surprised.
Yeah, I wanted her to do this podcast, but she's has other stuff to do. Anyway, let's jump in. What led you to write this book?
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, after I wrote the Making a Biblical Womanhood, with its surprise success that freaked everyone out, including me. When they came back and said, do you have something else to write? And I was like, no way. I was like, I'm going back to medieval sermons where it's nice and safe and quiet. And then I had a conversation with Scott McKnight. And Scott was like, Beth, don't let anyone pressure you into writing anything else. And he said, but if there's something you left unsaid, he said, now's the time for you to say it. And I thought about it. And the one thing I'd really left unsaid was the piece on women's ordination. Okay. I just hadn't really had time to talk about that in the Making a Biblical Womanhood. And so while I'm kind of thinking about this, I was also teaching a grad seminar. I think it was my Women in Religion grad seminar. And one of the books I was reading to prep for it was by one of my colleagues at Baylor, Elizabeth Flowers. And she has this really fantastic book called Into the Pulpit, Women in Power, Southern Baptist Women in Power in the post-World War II era. And I was reading about the rise of the conservative resurgence, the fundamentalist takeover of the SBC that starts in the late 70s. And and she was talking about sort of the precursors leading up to that and into the early 80s. And I noticed that the women that she was highlighting who were on the vanguard of this conservative resurgence, we always hear about the men, but there were women who were on the vanguard of the conservative resurgence too, who were fighting specifically against women's ordination. And these women were all pastors' wives. And that something in my brain connected. And I was like, that's really fascinating. I actually called Betsy and I was like, Betsy? And she was like, no one's ever talked about this, Beth. She was like, I think there's something there too. And I was like, okay, I know that I'm a pastor's wife. I know this world. And I know I was like, let me see if something's there. And that's where this book
Huh.
began.
That's right. You are a pastor's wife. I mean, you're also a
I
professor
am.
and a scholar and best-selling author. But you're not a
Oh,
traditional pastor's wife, but you're a pastor's wife.
you would be surprised how traditional I actually am in many ways, but yeah, I mean, and I do talk about this in the book that I'm actually happy my ministry gifts actually fit some of the
Hmm.
stereotypes of a pastor's wife role. Like, I much
Yeah.
prefer to be behind the scenes. I
Yeah.
much prefer to kind of be like, okay, what needs to be done? Let's go do it. I'm not traditional in the sense I'm not good at, I don't want to teach children. Please don't really make me teach children. I can sit in the room and maybe help if you need another adult.
Yeah.
And please never ask me to play the piano. But aside from that, I'm a let's do what needs to be done to get
Yeah.
this going. And so the role of pastor's wife, I guess, wasn't as jarring on my gifting as a woman. And so it was a slower revelation to me how absolutely weird the role is. And it was anyway, it was fascinating doing this research. I'll tell
Hmm.
you, I'm planning to actually do a couple of academic articles based on, I have this
Really?
huge database. I mean, I've read 150 pastor's wife books.
Oh my
Um,
word! Wow. So you
yeah,
you 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 tackled this as a scholar. I mean, you did a ton of
oh,
research for this.
totally, totally. Yeah, yeah, totally. This book is, I mean, I have in the back, I have an appendix where I list all of the books in
Hmm.
chronological order from
Hmm.
1923 to 2023.
Wow.
That we used for this. So people can go back and check it.
So I have so many questions. I don't even know where to
Yeah,
start.
let me start.
Okay. So, and a lot of this is just my perception of the pastor's wife world. So I would love to know if it's accurate or not. Um, it is it true, or is it pretty widespread in the church that when a church hires a male pastor, it's sort of assumed
Yeah.
that his wife will do all these things, and it's like an unpaid position. It's like they're getting a 2-for-1. It's expected that she leads the women's ministries. It's expected she's going to have a certain personality. It's expected she's going to be present at this and that and this and that. Is that pretty widespread? And what do you think about that?
So yes and no. Let me just put
Okay.
that one out there for you. One of my chapters is called Two for the Price of One,
Yeah.
which
Okay.
every woman who's a pastor's wife is like, yes, that's exactly right. And there is, since in the 20th century, especially beginning in the mid to latter part of the 20th century, um, we begin to see these assumptions that the pastor's wife labor comes alongside her husband's job, that this is an expected component within um, more, I would say, sort of the broader evangelical and evangelical adjacent world. There are some parallels if you think about like the Methodist Church. I did some sprinkling, like trying to read around and see what's going on. If you think about like further back 19th century UK role, women in who are married to these village parish priests, there sort of are these expectations, but in some ways it's actually a class-based expectation. Like women in the higher classes go and take food to the poor and go and visit and those sort of things. And so that was something the pastor's wife did, but it was sort of more of a class expectation because she would be in the gentry class her husband was often appointed by the local lord or whoever had control over that parish, etc. You can just think all your Jane Austen
Yeah.
movies and all of all the priests within that. So just think about that. But in the U.S., in the mid 20th century, we really began to see this expectation pick up with the pastor's wife role. And in some ways, it parallels broader cultural shifts in the US. This goes right along with that post World War II shift. Let's get women out of jobs to get men back into jobs. And so let's talk about what women do to support their husbands because that helps normalize society.
Hmm.
The pastor's wife role kind of is part of this broader cultural trend.
It just followed the cultural trend. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but what makes it different? is that the pastor's wife role begins to be perceived as a separate calling by God. And it begins to be seen as a specific, not just a specific ministry calling, but the highest ministry calling for women. Okay. And so when we start thinking about moving into the 70s, especially the 80s and the 90s, is where you really begin to see this vocational calling that if you are called to ministry, you are called to marry a minister.
Oh, wow.
And it's especially prominent in evangelical spaces. I would say also a lot that are connected with the more conservative part of the U.S., which is often the southern states, and over to the West. So you think about your background in California, that's actually part of sort of this broader shift, and a little bit up into the Midwest.
Again, just anecdotally, I mean, I talk about this all the time on the podcast. So I hope people aren't sick of it. But I mean, I was raised in a conservative environment, masters and John MacArthur, and it had some, pros and cons of that experience, like any journey. But that was, I remember, especially in the undergrad, I could think of specifically, I'm not going to name anybody, but I could think of several girls, college students, females that were like, I going to marry a pastor, and I want a pastor that is like John MacArthur, that preaches like him and is a strong leader. And I don't know if they use the language calling, but it's very clear, like, oh yeah, so-and-so, yeah, she's going to be a pastor's wife. And it was very much just this like high call, not marry a godly man or whatever, but like, I want to serve my pastor, and I want to come along, like help him preach well and do whatever I can to serve him in his ministry, which I'm not saying that negatively or whatever, but it's just, it confirms what you're saying. Yeah.
It's this sort of thing, because on the one hand, it's like, well, yeah, we want to support our spouses. That's nothing wrong with supporting your spouses. What's happened with the pastor's wife role is that it has become not just it's become an expectation, but it literally has become part of the pastor position. So for a man to be hired into a role involves the interview as well as the labor of his wife. And so if a woman is not willing to be the type of pastoral support that the church expects, that can cost her husband the job. And this becomes sort of this, and it's not an unspoken thing either. The thing is that this is written in Christian literature to women. This is something, as I said, I read 150 of this genre. It is also something that began to be taught in seminaries. The 6 flagship SBC seminaries, especially in the 90s, by the 90s and early 2000s, Southwestern, Southern, Southeastern, all had the Institute for Seminary, the Seminary Institute for Ministers' Wives, or something, the Institute for Ministers' Wives. And it was training women up for this, on how to use their labor to support their husband's job. And
I had a question about the stated and unstated. Like was that, as I've talked to some pastors' wives, it was almost this unstated expectation, which I feel like is almost worse. Like if a church on a church level, like if a church says, all right, we're on the hunt, we're hiring a pastor, and all right, this pastor's great. How's your marriage? Good. Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. You're hired. And then if it's like all these unstated expectations of the wife, I feel like that's almost worse than a church saying, hey, the way we run things here is we expect the pastor's wife to check off these boxes. Does yours do that? At least it's up front. You can say, well, okay, maybe that's not the church for me if my wife doesn't check off those boxes, but it's almost worse, I think, having it unstated.
So
what do you think?
I think it's both here. By stated, what I mean is that in this pastor's wife literature, it is really clear. It is really clear that this is what women are called to do. And so a couple of times in the book, I kind of just walk through, like, one of the books that's always taught at the SBC seminaries is Gloria Furman's book. I think it's 2008. Also, I used Gail McDonald's book, High Calling, High Privilege. And Dorothy Patterson's book, of course, Handbook for Ministers' Wives. You can, all of these, they state really clearly. You can also think about Doug Wilson's wife. I read Nancy Wilson's pastor's wife book for this, and they state very clearly that this is your job. In fact, Dorothy Patterson says you really shouldn't have any other job. she's like, if you have to do it to make financial ends meet, that's okay, I guess. But really, it is best for you to be this unpaid support staff, because if your husband needs you on the fly, if the church needs you on the fly, you can't be like, okay, I can come when my job's over. You need to be available at all times for anything that's needed. And that's the message that's given. Churches, yes, who also feed into this expectation, they will have this they often don't explain what those parameters are. Like, what do we mean that you should be available at a drop of a hat? What does it mean? Like often things you see as women get shocked by how much their appearance is judged.
Really?
I mean, really horrific things about, especially women's weight. And you can think about pastors' wives whose husbands get into these roles when they're in their 20s, and then they start having kids and all of that sort of stuff. And these women who felt like their bodies were being shamed. And in fact, one pastor's wife book says that your weight is a sign of your spiritual health. And so if your weight is not under control, which I suspect in the 80s and 90s meant sort of our very thin image of a woman, that is a sign of you not having a good spiritual life, devotional life with God. So I think those unexpected and nobody really knowing, like if you don't show up for an event and then suddenly you've caused this huge thing where everybody at church is wondering if y'all are getting divorced because you didn't show up for this one event because you were tired. Those types of unexpected things. I think so. Churches don't state them, but the pastor's wife literature and what's taught in these courses says this is what you are supposed to do.
So it's in the ethos. Yeah.
Yes.
For sure in the ethos. It's but churches aren't, when I say unstated, I mean, they don't, like when they're hiring a pastor, it would be better if they had, here are the specific things we expect your wife to be doing, so that at least at that point, before he gets hired, he can say, that's not going to happen. You haven't met my wife, she doesn't have these specific gifts or desires or callings. So
I tell a story in the beginning of one of the chapters. I think it's I can't remember. It's 2 for the Price of 1, maybe, is the beginning of it. But I tell a story. It's a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, who also has her PhD. And she told a hiring committee, her husband was a finalist for a job, and they asked her what she thought she was going to be doing. And she was like, I'm pregnant with our second kid. I have a full-time job. I'm defending my dissertation soon. And she's like, I'll be a faithful church member. And they were horrified by that. And they actually told her husband, they didn't give him the job. And they said, you are our number one candidate until we talk to your wife. Because they didn't see her as being, So, I mean, at least they figured that out before they got to the church, got offered at the church.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, really shocking if you think about it.
Where do they find this in scripture, or do they? I would love to know. Do you have a chapter on like what are the best exegetical? Because
Yes. So, I mean, this book, like the Making a Biblical Womanhood, walks through 2,000 years of church. Well, Making a Biblical Womanhood went back further, but this one walks through 2,000 years of church history.
Oh, wow.
So, my first chapter is Where's Peter's Wife? And that's exactly what this is. It's exactly, it's like, because this is the irony of the pastor's wife role. And I'm not arguing it's a bad role. I see the value of it. I've been doing this role for over 25 years. But at the same time, it is a culturally constructed role that has no correlation in scripture. There just isn't. It's just not there. People can try, and one of the amusing things, I suppose, about reading all of these pastor's wife books is seeing how people tried to use different scripture passages to support the pastor's wife role. And they were inconsistent because there is no clear model within the Bible. And the one, Dorothy Patterson, I suppose, is the most blatant about, I would say, her scriptural distortion. She actually has this whole section on Priscilla and Aquila, where she argues that Priscilla is the quintessential pastor's wife role who's supporting the ministry of her husband. And
It
I
would
don't
almost be the
care.
opposite, actually, exegetically.
That's actually what I suggest. I'm like, I mean, sort of tongue. I would say, I actually might think the Bible would be more supportive of thinking about Aquila as the first pastor's husband. If you think about it from that, what the text actually shows. So it's simply not there. And that doesn't mean it's not a role we should have. It just is highly ironic that people who insist on biblical literalism, I can't say that word.
Literalism.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
For some reason, it can't come out of my mouth, but who insist on that, then are insisting on a ministry role that they advocate as the highest ministry calling for women, which isn't a biblical role at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, that's my first chapter.
Just for the audience, in case they didn't catch what we were kind of alluding to, with Priscilla and Aquila, they're mentioned 6 times in the New Testament. 4 times her name's mentions first, which is that's really abnormal in a first century context, unless one, she has a higher social and economic status, or she was the more influential partner. Either way, and whatever they're mentioned together, they're both the subject of the verbs when they took Apollos aside. They explained to him the word of God more accurately. When Paul praises them in Romans 16, everything is very much mutual, which again, in a first century context, that's really pretty striking, So anyway, that's why we were, you can speculate why she's mentioned first, why not all the time, or, why 4 the times, but either way, clearly it's not that she is like supporting him and his ministry role or whatever. It is a dual role that they're playing. So.
Yeah, and I'll give you an Easter egg in the book. So we got it out of most of the copies, but some of the copies, somewhere, the way my brain works, I conflated Acts 18 with Romans 16 and say Acts 16.
Oh no! Is that in the first print? So wait, the second print will fix that, or
yeah, it'll have it. We got it actually out of some of the copies. It was one of those things. The day after it went to print, I saw it and I sent it to my editor was like, oh my gosh. I mean, we had like this whole conversation about the sentence like right above it. Yeah. And so it was, anyway, I was like, well, there's my Easter egg.
Yeah. Those mistakes are so obvious that it's like, to me, it's like, that's not a big deal. It's more like if it was, not. It's like, clearly this is just a,
well, flip, it's one of those things too. Your brain reads over it so many times, you don't see it. And when I did see it, I was like, I knew exactly what I did. I conflated because I had just been talking about Acts 18. And then I went to Junia in Romans 16 and I conflated. Yeah. So anyway, it's kind of funny. I thought you would find that funny.
This is fun. I've literally spent the last several months in Romans 16 and then following Priscilla and Aquila around and a deep dive into Junia and Andronicus. So so this is all fresh in my mind. So there's a few married couples. Priscilla and Aquila are by far the most influential. Gosh, they set up house churches in at least 2 different cities, ministered in 3 or 4. I mean, they were Paul's co-workers. I mean, dynamic duo. No evidence that she is playing some kind of pastor's wife role that we're talking about today.
Right.
Junius and Andronicus, we have 1 verse on them in Romans 16:7. They did something so outlandish that it landed them in prison, which for a woman in the first century is extremely rare. But they're both called apostles.
Yep. Absolutely.
I think there's another. Is there another married? I thought there was 3 in the New Testament married.
Well, there's Sapphira.
Ananias and Sapphira.
Yeah, there's Anna, and I actually almost talked about them. I cut out a section on Sapphira just because. Well, part of it was also length. I tend to write way too much anyway, so part of it was length. But they were the other couple, and I think Nije Gupta had a statement that really struck me when I was reading Tell Her Story, in which he argues, where he just simply says, look, this is a negative story. They're both doing bad things, but it's fascinating that it is both husband and wife who are brought in and who answer and are held responsible for the charges.
Independently.
Right. Yeah. This isn't sort of like she's not held responsible because of her husband, or she's not given a pass because she's under her husband's authority. She is brought in and seen as an equal partner of this crime within the church. And
Hmm.
so that also, again, this emphasis on women's independent leadership, for better or for worse, that the early church recognized. So she was in an early draft
Okay.
and got cut, just simply, I also had to cut
Nice.
Tabitha. Yeah. It was just too
Okay.
much.
Oh,
There's too many
Tabitha
things to
too.
talk
Yeah.
about.
You have lots of stories of, Lydia, Tabitha. You get the impression that they're probably wealthy widows or,
Right.
yeah. I mean, that's not, perhaps, well,
They're
even if they were married, their husband's not even mentioned, which that would, again, show some level of, she's not supporting her husband in his
right.
ministry.
That's exactly right.
And so in all the three married couples that we've mentioned, including Ananias and Sapphira, there is zero evidence that he's doing some kind of ministry and she's simply supporting him in his ministry.
So I'm curious, in all your study, did you look at the archaeology of the catacombs, like the Priscilla catacombs and the catacombs in Naples that show all, anyway, I talk about the Priscilla
Yeah.
catacombs in this book too. I have a
Oh,
section
I
on it.
just dabbled. I mean, a little
Yeah.
bit, but I'm because that deals more with like the history or reception
Yep.
of Priscilla. I
Because
didn't know that
Mhm.
she was like widely hailed like after her death. I mean that her
Well,
reputation.
yeah. I mean, the Priscilla catacombs probably aren't I just dropped my book, so sorry about
Oh,
that. But the Priscilla catacombs probably aren't from her. They're actually, but her name was so popular.
right.
They're later. It's a 3rd and 4th century.
Mm,
There was a tradition that maybe Priscilla and Aquila were buried in there. That becomes an early medieval tradition.
okay.
But if you ever have a chance, you should go. They're
Huh.
amazing. They have more images of women on the walls in the
Wow.
Priscilla catacombs than I think any other place.
Is this in
And
Ephesus or Rome or where is
this is
this?
in Rome. This is in Rome.
Rome.
You can just go. Yeah, I mean, I took 15 high schoolers to it, and I was on my son's senior trip in
Huh.
Italy, and I took it was I talked about the trip a little bit. It was actually
Yeah.
hysterical taking them on it, but so I took all these high schoolers on that trip with me because
Wow.
I wanted to see those women on the walls. And
Wow.
next time I go back, I'm going to send them my letter, my archive letter, so I can get a private tour.
Man, I was in Rome a few years ago and it was a
Yeah,
quick, we just were running around super fast,
yeah,
but
that's
dang,
exactly it.
yeah,
Yeah.
that would be fascinating to see.
You should do it. Yeah, I want to go to
Yeah.
Naples too because Naples has these two women on and I've had people send me pictures of them, and I've used them in my teaching. But they have the Gospels are around their head, and there's tongues of fire coming
Oh,
out,
wow. Huh.
and they're clearly the symbolism with them is clearly the symbolism of bishops,
Oh,
and
wow.
it's just really,
Interesting.
yeah, it's
Well, I know,
fascinating.
Sandra Glahn and Lynn Cohick have been doing a lot of work with all this stuff, right? In
Yes,
Italy. Yeah,
I
yeah,
got some pictures from them. They were over there not too long ago.
yeah.
Yeah, for the visual museum.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, I'm
Oh, is that what
actually
they're doing? They're producing something. Yeah, what is that?
so they're doing an online website. It's all free. You can download all of the images and use them, and it's images of women serving in leadership roles throughout church history. And they're just, uh, one of the things I say at the end of either my first or second chapter, I can't remember, but it's just like the evidence of women in church leadership is everywhere.
Hmm,
We just have to look.
hmm.
And literally in Rome, you just got to look on the walls. You got to
Interesting.
look, in the medieval world, you just got to look at the images. We see women holding croziers, which is a sign of a bishop. I
Wow.
have a whole chapter on a medieval woman who essentially functioned as a bishop in the early medieval world and was ordained by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Um, you know, for all of those people who say not women ordained, I'm like, actually, there's a lot of women ordained. First 1,000 years of Christian history, we have clear evidence of it. So anyway,
Interesting.
it's all over the walls. It's all over the art of our buildings.
Have you happened to read Sister Prudence Allen's book, The Concept of Women?
So
Woman.
I think a
Um,
long time ago I did.
okay.
Um,
She came out
um,
with a condensed version because it's a 3 volume, I mean, massive, like
yeah. So
1,500 pages. But she came out with a fairly recent condensed version of it.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember when I read it, but I haven't read it recently.
So she, and I don't know if it was her or, so right now I'm just in her section on Plato and Aristotle. I think I just finished Aristotle. So maybe it's not her, it's somebody else. Cause the biggest question is like, where did the kind of suppression of women's ministry start in the early church? I know you're getting all giddy, but I think she or somebody said it was the kind of the resurrection of the belief that women were ontologically inferior, which you have lots of statements throughout church history along those lines, where what before that was sort of resurrected, which that's actually very Aristotelian. You had you had women occupying all kinds of levels of church ministry. But anyway,
that's exactly right. I would say it's that is certainly part of it. I mean, in some ways, that idea never goes away. There's always because there's always arguments that women's bodies are inferior to men. But at the same time, we have clear evidence of women still serving in these types of leadership roles. And, we also know that Roman women, this is something we don't think about as much, but Roman women were also serving at the altar. Megan DeLuzio has that great book called A Place at the Altar about non-Christian pagan women in Roman religion who are serving in these very high positions, including, this is something that Nije also drew to my attention too, thinking about the Vestal Virgins. They're actually the highest religious authority in Rome. And so, I mean, there's limitations, but at the same time, we always focus on the limitations instead of focusing on the fact that all of these religious figures to some extent have limitations on them. But yet women are still serving in these roles. So the body is part of it. We begin to see that. But I would argue more it's the evolution of sacramental theology. And with that, the evolution of a clear definition of ordination that becomes tied to sacramental theology. And that doesn't happen until the Central Middle Ages. So that's one of the things. Gary Macy, I don't know if you've read Gary Macy's book, The Hidden History of Women's Ordination. He's with Oxford University Press. He's a great medievalist. And, it's a book that all medievalists know. We've been reading, we're like, and it's I mean, a stellar book. And in it, he just walks through the evolution of what happens with what he calls this presbocentric explosion that really takes place in the Central Middle Ages. And this also coincides with the emphasis on clerical celibacy, which, trying to differentiate the clergy from the lay people. And this also re-emphasizes the problems of female bodies, because if in order to have sacramental power, you have to be a celibate priest, then that makes women's bodies even especially dangerous. And so that's, but that is not clearly articulated. It's an evolution until the Central Middle Ages.
William Witt, Icons of Christ is an excellent book that traces a lot of this.
Yep.
If I remember correctly, he says, that it was, he deals a lot with the sacramental arguments. 12 apostles, all male, you can almost draw a straight line there. And then also mediating the sacraments. As a male Christ, you need a male person mediating the
male body of Christ, to handle the male, I mean, the male priest to handle the male body of Christ, And
does a modern body. We're getting off track. We're going back to your other book, Beth, but hey, it's still
no, this is in this one too.
Oh, it is. Okay.
I actually do the ordination piece a lot better in this one.
Okay.
So this is, as I said, in the Making a Biblical Womanhood, it was I just skated the surface of it, but this one I did a deep dive on it. And so my medieval skills as a medieval church historian, I think are on better display in this book.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So we're not off track. We're not off topic. I was like, we need to bring it back. Okay.
Exactly right. You're good.
I've had a super busy and quite stressful last few weeks. Deadlines were piling up. The stresses of life were caving in. And man, these things can take a toll on your body. I wasn't sleeping well, or definitely not sleeping enough. And this would normally just drain me. This is why I'm so thankful for AG1. And I'm seriously, guys, this is not just some slimy sales pitch. This is actually my real life. Your body, my body, we need nutrition. And it's really hard to give your body all the nutrition that it needs, especially when life is super busy and super stressful. This is why I drink AG1 every single day. I've been doing so for over 2 years now. Sometimes I even take it twice a day if I just need extra nutrition. One scoop of AG1 blasts your body with high quality nutrition. It supports my gut health. It gives me sustained energy, which I feel. It supports my immune system, which is super important right now because it seems like literally everybody is getting sick. And I can't afford to go down. It's super easy to make AG1 a part of your routine. I mean, it mixes really easy. It's not like chalky or chunky, and it actually tastes good. It's not too sweet, but just flavorful enough to make it easy to drink. It's never too late to create a new healthy habit for 2025. So try AG1 for yourself. It's something I've actually been able to stay consistent with, and that's why I've been partnering with AG1 for so long. AG1 is now offering new subscribers a free $76 gift when you sign up. You'll get a welcome kit, a bottle of vitamin D3K2, and 5 free AG1 travel packs in your first box. Make sure to check it out. drinkag1.com/TITR to get this offer. That's drinkag1.com/TITR to start your new year out on a healthier note. What's the relationship between modern Protestant, for lack of better terms, complementarian approaches in relation to its sacramental roots?
Yeah.
Are they completely different, or is the modern Protestant growing out of the sacramental?
So, this is actually what William Witt does that's so brilliant. Although his book is very dense. And so it often, but what he does in it that's so brilliant is he really emphasizes the how the Catholic reasons for preventing women for barring women from the priesthood are vastly different from modern Protestant differences. And the reason is because the Catholic one really emphasizes it's the body. It's the problem of the female body, which is why there's loopholes in Catholic theology, because women can overcome their bodies and move into positions of leadership. But in Protestantism, it's not the body. It is a divine mandate. That men and women are called to separate roles. And that one of these roles, despite all of the language that's an equal calling, they're not. When it's a hierarchical thing. And that really is a modern development. There's hints of it in the past. You can find it in various, you can find everything in Augustine, actually. At some point, if you look hard enough, you can find something from him to support. He did so much. But you find a lot of hints of it in the past. But it's very much a post-Reformation development. And in this book, I actually, I have my chapter, The Rise of the Pastor's Wife, in which I talk about the pastor's wife role. The seeds of it are in the Reformation, where because marriage is a symbol of Protestant resistance, of evangelical resistance, to be a priest in the Reformation era, to be a Protestant priest in the Reformation era was to be married. So the pastor's wife became a symbol of resistance. I mean, it's actually a heroic role when at first it was a dangerous role. A lot of women were killed in this role because they dared marry a pastor. But it's also the first time in history where marriage becomes connected to the clerical role in a substantial way. Leonard Sweet in his book on the pastor's wife, which is there's him and Margaret Watts, both have these books on the history of the pastor's wife role. And Leonard Sweet starts off his book with this very annoying statement where the pastor's wife role has always been a part of the church. And I say in the book, I wrote in the margins of that the first time I saw it, I said, there's a difference between being married to a pastor and being a pastor's wife. And during the, really up through the Reformation era, being married to a minister did not automatically sign you up for the job.
It didn't.
It's not until the Reformation that becomes sort of begins to be this automatic, that if you are married to a pastor, you're married to his job in some degree. But there's still more options for women. There's some women who serve as pastors, ministers with their husbands. There's some women, like I tell, one of my favorite stories that Margaret Watts tells is about this woman in Scotland who got mad at her husband because he sided on a different side of a religious dispute from her. And so she stopped going to his church. And every Sunday morning, he would help her on her horse and she would ride across the town to a different church that supported her views. And that, and she was a pastor's wife.
So
is that funny? I know, it's so funny. And her pastor husband would he must have been a very gentle soul. He would just help her get on her horse and let her ride off to the other side of town to attend services.
Wasn't Martin Luther? Sorry, to cut you off. Yeah.
No, that's okay. Go on.
Martin Luther's wife. Wasn't she kind of a spunky? I know she brewed some beer and yeah.
So, one of my very good friends, actually, you're going to like this book. One of my very good friends at Baylor is a Luther scholar. He's a Reformation scholar, David Whitford. And he has a book coming out on Luther and masculinity. Which is just really, and so I actually got him to give me some early stuff of that. So I quote him in my section on Catherine, on Katerina. People call her all sorts of different things, von Bora. But yeah, while, people often assume, like I remember one of the first pastor's wife's role books I was given, it was one of Ruth Tucker's books. I don't talk about Ruth Tucker in the book very much just because she had such a tragic life. I don't know. But she desperately tried to find historical justification for what she was expected to do. And she transforms Katie Luther into this, this pastor's wife who takes care of the house and does the food and all of this sort of thing. And while Katie did do some of those things, she also she was a theologically trained woman who went head to head with Luther and his friends. And she, so there's aspects of her life that you can make look like the pastor's wife, but there's aspects of her life that just don't fit into it at all. Except for the fact that when Luther died, she lost all of her influence, and which, is a tragic part of the pastor's wife role. And I connect that the final chapter of this book actually follows a clergy sex abuse case that I found in the archives that I tell through the lens of the pastor's wife. And it's a really, it's a hard chapter.
Can you get into that one a little? I mean, do you mind talking about it?
No, I don't mind. So I tell people the Making a Biblical Womanhood was a story I knew. I'd been teaching it since 2008 at Baylor. It was my research. I didn't really have to do a lot of research for it. I knew that story. Becoming the pastor's wife is a story I didn't know. I told you the origin of it, and it's all based on primary source and new secondary source reading research that I, except for the medieval chapters, I knew a lot of what was going on in those. So when I was in the archives in Nashville, looking at, and in the Southern Baptist Archives in Nashville, there's a collection called the Minister's Wives Conference. Because since 1958, and I talk about this conference, this is an amazing conference. In 1958, a whole bunch of early 1950s, they get together and they're like, we need help. We need a place where we can get together and we can talk about what's going on with this role, where we can provide advice for this. And so I was looking through their conference papers, and in the midst of it, I ran across this ordination crisis about these two women who got ordained in the early 80s, who were pastors' wives, and it caused this whole huge stink. And so I got more documents more boxes. I asked for more boxes to try to find more about this story. And I tell this story also in the book, Kathy Hoppe and Sarah Wood-Lee. And I was in the Jimmy Draper files, and Jimmy Draper was president of the Southern Baptist Convention between 1982 and 1984. He presided over the 1984 resolution that said women can't be pastors because of the sin of Eve. So, and he supported that. And so I'm in his files reading about this ordination crisis with these two women, these two ordained pastors' wives. And I run across a series of letters that were completely unconnected to any of it. And it was this man who wrote in who said the Southern Baptist Mission Board, it was actually the International Mission Board, the Foreign Language Department, has hired a man who's committed clergy sex abuse and who's confessed to it. And he said, and you need to know this, and I recommend that you not allow him to serve as an ordained pastor in the Southern Baptist Church. And this is the week before the 2023 SBC that I find this in the archives. So it's, and that's the eve of the SBC about to kick out these two churches, Rick Warren's church and Linda Barnes Popham, for having women, ordaining women, as well as the first round of the law amendment, which if the SBC had passed it in 2024, it would have barred women from any pastoral role in the Southern Baptist Church, which is the harshest restriction, I would argue, in Western history on women in ministry, except for maybe in some pocket areas, the largest sort of big thing. So it's the week before that I'm in the archives and I run across this case of potential clergy sex abuse. And what really caught my attention about it is at first Jimmy Draper responds. He's like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Let me see if I can figure stuff out. So he reaches out to William Tanner, who's the head of the I guess it's the Home Mission Board. It's the North American Mission Board. So it is under that. And William Tanner's like, well, let's reach out to the guy who hired him. And so they reach out to Oscar Romo, who is the head of the Foreign Language Division. Oscar Romo writes back and says, yeah, we knew this, but he hasn't done anything since then. And it's all good. And he said it happened a long time ago in Toronto. And then Jimmy Draper writes back and says, okay, that's great. And one of them uses, it's in there, and he's like, we have to be a redemptive community. And they close the case on it. And I couldn't let that case, I couldn't find anything else in the archives, the SBC archives, about this. I found a whole lot about the man. I tell the whole story about the man and his wife through the lens of his wife. But I went to Toronto. It took me 8 months to put the story together. I went to Toronto and I pretty much found everything. And including interviews with people who were at the church where this happened. And and as I said, it's this callous attitude towards not investigating a sexual predator, a known sexual predator who's confessed, at the same time that they are also beginning this very hard turn, pushing women out of all leadership roles in the Southern Baptist Convention. Though the juxtaposition of those two things just were so bright. And and so that's my final chapter of this book, as I tell that story and how it connects.
So I think you might have answered my question. I was asking, what's the relationship between the rest of the book and bringing in sexual abuse? It's to show the juxtaposition of the two.
Yep. That's exactly right. And that at the same time, that these attitudes go together of not listening to women. And when you don't have women in leadership roles, in respected leadership roles, and it's, this is harmful. I mean, this is why the Southern Baptist Church is in the position that it's in right now. They haven't been listening to women for a really, really long time. And so I do think these things, and really, I tell this story through the lens of the pastor's wife, and it's a lot. Her life was very challenging living with this man. And so I tell some of that story, sort of the precarity of the pastor's wife role, which happens when we create a ministry position that is so highly regarded, but yet has no independent authority and has no independent sort of like, what do you do if a pastor's wife is in trouble? What do you do if the wife in a church, her husband's abusive? How does she get help when all of the men who are in leaders in that church are supporting her husband? How does she get help when if she tells somebody about her husband, it's going to cost the breadwinning component? And like this pastor's wife, she had 6 kids. What do you do? What happens when you have created a role for women in ministry that is completely dependent on the good behavior of men?
You're just,
And
oh man, yeah, that's that. You're creating
yeah,
structures that are not inevitably will go bad. I mean, there could be all good people involved, but
wonderful.
if there
Yeah,
are a few bad apples, the structures are gonna not be
that's
able to call that
exactly right.
out. That's
That's exactly right.
dangerous.
It's
Wow.
extremely dangerous, and it's much more common than I think people realize.
It is all everything you're saying. I keep picturing like complementarian churches, but would this apply to either one? I mean, a pastor's wife is a pastor's wife,
Yes,
or
yes, 100%. And the structures, I mean, this is the thing, this pastor's wife role, and I also state this in the book. My final chapter is called The Cost of Dorothy's Hats, where that's what I called, thinking about this role. And it was symbolic because, of course, Dorothy Patterson's hats, emphasize this. I mean, she was a powerful woman, powerful minister's wife, powerful leader in the church, but her hats indicated that she's always under the authority of her husband and under the authority of other men. And so what this minister's wife role does, in some ways, it masks the absence of women in independent ministry roles. And I cite research on this too at the end of chapter 7, that churches in which women serve in these pastors' wives' role that are unpaid, but yet still highly visible and influential, that ordinary people in the congregation don't actually realize that their church doesn't support women in ministry.
wow.
Because they're like, our pastor's wife does all of this. It's just
Yeah.
like, so a pastor's wife role covers
Mhm.
the absence of women in these independent ministry roles.
Yeah.
And it also indicates that a woman's authority is always dependent. It's always a mediated role. And it works out fine. I've been married to a great man for over 25 years. I have not had I've had weird stories as a pastor's wife. We all do.
Yeah.
Weird things people say to you and stuff. But I have a good man as my husband.
Yeah.
And but not all pastors' wives do. And what we've done is we've created a position that silences their voices and makes it where these women who are in these very vulnerable positions can't get help. Which is, again, I think about Lucy Peppiatt. I just love where she says, "Where does your theology lead?"
Mm.
And that's, where does your theology lead?
Lucy's great. Man,
I love her. Yeah.
she's awesome. Just an awesome person. I don't know her well.
Oh, yeah.
I'm actually going to be out in Nottingham this summer, and I'm hoping to love to
Yeah.
see
I
her in
love her.
person. But she's just a gracious and wise and just a godly woman. Um, well, you know what? Where I get worried is you take the whole problem of like narcissism and church leadership, and it seems like there's something about a traditional pastor role that seems to attract uh
Yeah.
narcissistic leaders. I mean, narcissism is, there's people that struggle with this, it's widespread or whatever, but there's something about like church, the way we created church, that it seems to be, and I'm not sure if the data brings us out, maybe you would know. I mean,
Does.
like a higher percentage of narcissistic leaders. I don't know if
Mm.
what's his face who wrote the book on that has data on that. I haven't read it.
Safe Church.
No, when narcissism comes to
Oh,
church,
yeah.
is that
Chuck wrote.
Chuck?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is
I
that what
wish
he
he
wrote?
was.
Yeah. With narcissism, maybe.
I
Anyway,
haven't.
you can
I
check me
still
on
haven't
that.
read it. Anyway, point is, man, when you combine a narcissistic male pastor with the strange and unique pressures of a pastor's wife, that if she's in an unhealthy emotional,
Right.
physical, or sexual relationship with her narcissistic husband, when she can't blow the whistle. I mean,
Right.
there's just so many things that, like this will bring down the ministry, bring down him and everything. And then you add the whole dynamic of being in a narcissistic, narcissistic relationship. I just, my heart just sinks when I think about somebody in that position.
Exactly right. And we talked so I have a podcast with the Bible for Normal People that's actually coming
Oh,
out,
yeah.
starts this week on
Okay.
women in the Southern Baptist Archives. It's called All the Buried Women.
Oh,
And it
gosh.
stems from some of the research in this book. And we interviewed a man named David Pooler, who's actually also one of my colleagues at Baylor, but I didn't know him until an article in Christianity Today that
Oh,
actually publicized his research on, and he does research on on post-traumatic stress syndrome within the victims of clergy sex abuse.
mm,
And it's really hard, heavy research. But one of the things that he talks about in that research is how churches, especially evangelical churches, in which, like the Baptist world, which doesn't have an ecclesiastical hierarchy, so to speak, and it doesn't work always in ecclesiastical hierarchies. The Catholic Church is clear on that. The Anglican Church, we've seen that. So it's not a magic bullet, but the Baptist Church doesn't have an ecclesiastical hierarchy. And so it is a place where these types of personalities that
mm,
are more magnetic, more
mm,
charismatic, and also more self-focused.
mm,
And even the whole nature of it, where, I've talked about this before, that in the evangelical church, our focus in the church service is actually the pulpit
mm.
and the
Yeah.
pastor. And that's not a biblical concept either.
No,
You're
it's
not
not.
going, no, I teach preaching and sermons in the medieval. That's not this is a new development in church history. And it magnifies
Yeah.
the importance of these people. And when it's an unhealthy personality, and then you combine it with with a structure that has only men at the table who are the only ones who are able to speak into this guy, who all support him, etc. And women just don't have a chance within
Yeah.
these structures.
Yeah.
And it's, complementarian churches, and with the pastor's wife role too. This is the problem in egalitarian churches also, is because they still have these same structures.
Yeah.
So, you can't just say we ordain women and that fixes the problem without
Yeah.
changing the structure.
I've talked
Yeah.
to several women in egalitarian
Yep.
denominations, and they're like, don't think because this is on paper that we don't deal with the same kind of
Absolutely.
male
Absolutely.
domination.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. So it's a hard problem, but I think the burden is on the church
Yeah.
to hear these women.
Have you seen any changes with the whole 2-for-1? Because I never even thought about this till like a few years ago,
Yeah,
when someone talked about, oh yeah, the wife. It's just like, yeah, it's 2-for-1. You get all this free labor. You're paying the pastor; he gets a salary.
right.
Woman, are people? And now I just look at it like, it just like seems so clear to me. Like this is problematic.
Yeah,
It's one thing if they say, hey, we got $80,000 to hire a senior pastor. Hey, we would love it if the wife could also volunteer. We're struggling. If it was a little more out in the open, and then let her and them make the decision, like, hey, is this something, because there's people that volunteer their time at church, whatever.
right.
But when it's just this unwritten expectation that she has a job description she didn't sign up for, might not even be gifted for, and isn't going to get paid for while her husband is, it's just weird. Anyway, there's my
Um,
rant. Are people waking up to that, and what
so,
changes are they
yes,
making?
I think so. Actually, that's one of my hopes for this book, is that it draws attention to because I think some people they don't realize. They grew up in this water. I grew up in that water where this is what, pastors' wives do. And it takes a while for you to dismantle it and be like, wait a minute, what? We actually expect her to do this labor, even though she's not paid for it. That's how I opened the book, is a story about this really sweet this lady who was a retired pastor's wife, telling me how she was going to keep doing the bulletin until the new pastor got married. And, she did, because he was not married yet. He doesn't have a wife. And it was, she's such a sweet woman, but it
Yeah.
was such a, this like of course that's what she's going to do, because that's what pastors' wives do. And so I think churches are beginning to see it, but at the same time, in these more conservative spaces, think about the trad wife movement. I mean, this is like the pastor's wife role on overdrive carried out more.
What is that? The trad wife?
It's an Instagram. It's an Instagram phenomenon.
Really?
This is what I argue. It's an Instagram.
I know a little bit about it. My daughters have told me about it. I'm like, wait, what?
It's what happened when you get biblical womanhood, the stay-at-home mom who is fully supports her husband's leadership in really over-the-top sort of ways, and even kind of becomes the pioneer woman and making her own flour and making all the clothes and, growing your vegetables and all of this sort of stuff. I mean, this over the top stuff that you can take pictures of it and post it on Instagram, and it makes it look like this beautiful, sort of life. And these influencers, these women make a whole lot of money off of doing this image, which we all know the reality behind it is, Instagram is not real life. But nonetheless, they have promoted this model of this stay-at-home, fully domestic mom that really is on steroids, sort of thing.
Okay.
And it is that's what the trad wife role is, and the pastor's wife role is, I think, is part of that same sort of idea. The pastor's wife role models for women how they should also act in their homes. Here we have this highly gifted, visible woman, but yet she is only a support staff to her husband. And that's the way you should also be in your home. So anyway, if that's part, it's this whole landscape.
So you're saying some churches, though, are now starting to either not require free labor from the pastor's wife, or they're paying them for, the work.
Mainline churches are much better at recognizing this now, I think. Some, I've heard stories from some people who the pastor's wife doesn't even go to the same church as her husband, mostly to kind of escape this thing, to be like, that's his job. I'm going to go to church and be faithful, but that's his job. It's not my job.
That seems a little unhealthy to me. I don't know. I don't want to just say categorically.
I'm not going to, I can see the response to it because I've lived in this space for so long. And, it's
sorry, real quick. I don't mean unhealthy in their marriage necessarily. It seems like that's probably a really unhealthy church situation. And she's surviving.
It could be, who knows? I don't know. But so I think some churches are more attuned to it. I think when the pastor is more outspoken about it, that is certainly very helpful, in helping to protect women from doing these types of things. If it's most of these places, it's a male pastor. So, and we don't have these expectations for women's husbands, for female pastors. That's something people kept asking me. They were like, well, are you going to talk about the husband's role? And I have a footnote and I'm like, men are not expected to do these things. It's just not there. They're expected to have their own jobs. When somebody's like, oh, he couldn't be here because he has a work thing, nobody's like, oh.
Yeah.
It's totally different. So, so I would say yes and no. Some places it's getting better. In some places it's not. We still have the SBC seminaries with the Seminary Wives Institute, and I've been looking at their curriculum and their book lists that they put out, and they are still teaching this 2-for-1 model.
Okay. Again, I guess, and we could wrap it up, but I don't know, just throughout this whole conversation, I just want to make it clear, like, if somebody to take this traditional pastor's wife role and all these, if the woman deep down genuinely wants to do that, I want to volunteer my time. I love going to women's breakfast. I would love to, if that is her desire and gifting, what she wants to do. Exactly. I'm not demeaning that at all. Whatever, you tried wife, whatever. But it's this unwritten expectation that she fits into a box that she might not fit into and then not get paid for it. I think that's what the problem is.
And I read these there's a lot of sadness in these pastors' wives' books. I'll just say that these women who, and that's why they write so many of them. They're trying to help other women in these positions because it's a hard position, and it's very hard to figure out how to navigate it. And so, and a lot of these women are exhausted and defeated.
Yeah.
And feeling like the problem, because, some of these books tell them if they're exhausted and defeated, it's because they haven't surrendered completely to Jesus. So it's your fault because you haven't given over to the role. And it's, yeah.
Did you read Josh Harris's wife's book? That's so bad.
Yes, I did. So I actually, so I caused up a stir because she sent it to me. I didn't talk about it in this book because I focused so much on the SBC. But she actually sent it to me, and I wrote an endorsement I read the whole thing, and I was like, people got to read this.
Yeah, and my wife read it. I feel like I read it through my wife telling me, like, summarizing as she went.
People have to read this. I was like, I don't care what you think about Shannon or Josh.
Shannon, yes.
Yeah, Shannon. But anyway, people got really mad at me because they said, well, she's left the faith. And because she's left the faith. And I was like, just the fact that you say that emphasizes why you need to read this book.
Yes.
No,
it was,
it's horrific. Mm-hmm.
It was triggering. Yeah. It was hard for my wife to read because it was so like, we came from similar environments, and I've never been a full-time paid pastor ever. So we've never had to deal with any of that, but we've been adjacent to a lot of it and seen friends go through that. And it was a tough but good eye-opening read for my wife.
Yeah. I mean, and it fits in this it fits in this narrative of this broader evangelical world that is connected to the Southern Baptist Convention with these similar types of ideas about what women should do. And Shannon's story is just it's really hard.
Yeah. Well, that's a sober ending to our conversation. But Beth, I will hold up your book one more time. The cover is brilliant. Yeah. Becoming the Pastor's Wife: How Marriage Replaced Ordination as a Woman's Path to Ministry. Beth, thank you so much for being a guest again on Theology and Raw. I really appreciate the conversation and just love talking with you. We should do it again sometime. Next time you come out with another book.
Well, thank you so much. It was good seeing you too.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.
Hey friends, if Theology and Raw has blessed or challenged you in any way, would you consider supporting the show through Patreon at patreon.com/Theology in the Raw? We are actually revamping our bonus material that Patreon supporters get. So we are going to 2 bonus Q&As per month for all the different paid levels. Silver level gets access to ask questions for the Q&A episode, and also you will get access to Exiles and Babylon archived content, which will be releasing different videos every month. Also access to bonus research episodes that I'm gonna record from time to time. Access to rough drafts of certain things I'm working on, which is a little scary for me to let people look into that because it's a rough draft. Gold and Gold Plus members get we have monthly Zoom chats and all the other perks that the other tiers get access to as well. So again, if you want to support the show, it really, really does help us to flourish as a ministry. Again, patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. I will see you in the community.